the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Friday, January 30th, 2015. We'll get an update today as the new Greek leftist Prime Minister, Alexis Tsipras, makes a major economic and political wave in Europe. And we'll cover the police shooting of a 16-year-old girl in Denver, Colorado, and get the latest in the Florida case of Marissa Alexander. Plus, the National Priorities Project dissects President Obama's new budget proposal and whether it really reflects middle-class economics, as he says. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Christina Mislan. She's an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Christina.
Hello, Sonali.
Well, just a day after U.S. officials and Kurdish rebels declared a major victory against the Islamic State group in Kobani, Syria, reports have emerged of a major attack by ISIS in the northern Iraqi city of Kirkuk against the local Kurdish population. Separately, a series of bombings killed nearly 24 people in Samarra and Baghdad as well. In Egypt, the first major attack by a group aligning itself with ISIS also took place. A number of simultaneous bombings left 26 people dead in the Sinai. The New York Times called it, quote, the most complicated and widely coordinated terrorist attack in Egypt in years. A group calling itself the Sinai Province of the Islamic State took credit for those attacks. And Jordan's negotiations with ISIS over a prisoner swap have come to a standstill, leaving the family of a Jordanian captured pilot on tenterhooks. ISIS demanded that Jordan deliver an al-Qaeda female prisoner named Sajida al-Rishawi to the Turkish border last night before it would release the pilot. His fate and that of a Japanese journalist being held with him remains unknown. Well, Christina, has ISIS seemingly upped the ante? It seems to be sprouting chapters all over the Arab world.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing is definitely a somewhat rapid expansion of ISIS. But, what can we expect when we've also seen an expansion of Europe and the U.S. in the region as well, albeit at different times? But I will say this. I saw a story in The Guardian this morning about women fighting for their community in a Syrian town, defending themselves from, and their family and community members from ISIS. And I thought, here's a story in which the U.S. Doesn't have to be involved, right? It's a story about people fighting for themselves. And so I think while we're seeing, and this is important because while we're seeing this kind of expansion of ISIS, I think it's also important to understand that that's not representative of the Arab world at all. And you have people like these women that's profiled in the story in The Guardian.
And here in the United States, Texas has executed yet another man, the second in the U.S. this week to die at the hands of the state. A 57-year-old African-American man named Robert Ladd was killed by lethal injection after the Supreme Court denied an appeal on the grounds of mental disability. Ladd was convicted of the brutal murder of a woman in 1996. Earlier this week, Georgia killed another African-American man named Warren Hill, whose attorneys made a strong case for a stay based on intellectual disability that the court also denied. Both men were killed by lethal injection. The court 2 days ago did stay the executions of 3 prisoners in Oklahoma, 2 white and 1 black, in response to a legal challenge of the cruelty and pain caused by at least one chemical used in that state's lethal injection cocktail. Arguments in their case will be heard by justices in April. Christina, it seems as though the application of capital punishment in the U.S. is extremely uneven, and we're still trying to find humane ways to commit a barbaric act, if that's even possible. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think capital punishment is not humane at all. And so anytime you have human beings making decisions about who gets to be executed or who doesn't, that's, there's so many questions to raise. And so I usually think everything is complicated. But to me, the solution here is simple. We have to humanely punish people for committing capital murder. Well, the answer is not capital punishment, and we have to end. So the solution is to get rid of capital punishment, period. And I think another reason to end capital punishment is, of course, the issue with all the people who have recently been pardoned when evidence has suggested and shown and proven that they're actually innocent. And so that's also a really big problem as well.
And finally, President Obama revealed the main thrusts of his 2016 budget proposal yesterday. In an op-ed in the New York Times, Vice President Joe Biden expanded on one major aspect of that proposal: aid to Central American countries. In response to the brief influx of child migrants arriving in the U.S. from countries like Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador last summer, the Obama administration plans to ask Congress to set aside $1 billion in aid, tripling the amount usually offered to the region. Biden wrote that the aid would, quote, help Central America's leaders make the difficult reforms and investments required to address the region's interlocking security, governance, and economic challenges. Strangely, he cited the U.S.-funded Plan Colombia as a model. Colombia has struggled for years with a right-wing U.S.-backed government funding paramilitaries that are as vicious as the rebels that they fought. Christina, while Central American countries do need aid, is what the U.S. is offering really going to help?
No, I mean, the short answer is no. I think that U.S. aid, another form of its soft power, has never helped any Latin American countries in the long term. That's economically, politically, socially, and so this definitely isn't the answer. But what I do think might be a start to actually talking about the real solutions might actually be maybe ending CAFTA, right? Free trade agreements like CAFTA. Also, the so-called war on drugs that continues to happen between not just with the U.S. government, but also between the U.S. government and Latin American governments. And so those are two things. I think if Obama and Biden proposed those as two solutions to start, I think we would start having a real conversation about what actually might help the Central American, the people living in Central America.
And we'll examine President Obama's budget in greater depth near the end of our program. Christina, thanks as always for joining us.
Thank you.
Christina Mislan is our daily Newsflash guest expert on Fridays. She is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. You can now watch Uprising online at our YouTube channel. That's at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Please do subscribe. It has barely been 1 week since Greece's parliamentary elections took Europe's political establishment by storm, with the stunning victory of the left anti-austerity party Syriza. In just the last few days alone, the new Greek Prime Minister, 40-year-old Alexis Tsipras, has thrown a major wrench into both economic and political works. In a nutshell, he has immediately put on hold planned privatizations of major Greek industries and infrastructure, causing financial markets to swing wildly, and he's met with Russian and Chinese representatives and blocked European moves to sanction Russia over Ukraine. He has also planned to reinstate workers and restore pension plans and much more. In the coming days, the Syriza government will attempt to renegotiate Greece's debt repayment plan, which was met by France with cautious optimism, but by Germany with outright hostility. Prime Minister Tsipras wants creditors to write off most of Greece's debt, but has also promised the country would not default. My guest is Nantina Vogontzas, and she is a Greek-American PhD student in sociology at New York University, focusing on political economy and social movements. She's active in the labor movement and currently a member of the UAW Graduate Student Organizing Committee. She lived and worked in Athens for a year following the 2012 elections there and will return to Greece shortly. She's also a member of the New York City-based Greek Solidarity Group, AKNY. Hi, Nantina.
Hi, thanks for having me, Sonali.
Well, let's focus on the financial side first, at least in broad strokes. How important was it that Mr. Tsipras froze the privatization deals of things like the port of Piraeus, as well as shares in the public utilities and the Hellenic petroleum? Was it worth the huge fall in Greek markets that we saw?
Yes, it was. I think it was very important that they took symbolic and yet strategic actions to show to the Greek people that a left government has been elected to protect the interests of the popular classes in Greece. And these reactions by the markets and by the EU business and political elites are, of course, expected, and Syriza has been preparing how to deal with those reactions.
So let's also talk about the things that Mr. Tsipras has already done within the last few days inside Greece. Already reintroduced the monthly minimum wage, reinstated workers that were fired, pension plans. I mean, just a huge sweeping restoration of much of the social safety net that was bit by bit dismantled under austerity. So and even symbolically taken down the barricades outside of the government halls. What is all of that? How is all of that being seen inside Greece?
Well, Syriza was elected on a platform to first deal with the humanitarian crisis that has been caused by 5 years of austerity. The Greek crisis has been experienced as a depression with levels that are commensurate to the Great Depression of the 1930s. And people said enough. We saw the social movements that brought Syriza to power. And so these were very important things to show to the Greek people that they're going to represent their interests at the bargaining table. I think what's important to look in the coming negotiations ahead is to see what the interests are of both sides on the table. And when I say both sides, I'm really talking about both sides of society. On the one hand, we have the political business elites of the EU, but also Greek capital. And on the other hand, we have the popular classes of Greece in the first instance, and then secondarily, the popular classes of Europe. And Syriza is the first government to be elected in Europe that is going to represent those classes. So we need to see what their interests are. It's very I just to kind of get into the discussion of what those interests are, it's very interesting to see how different factions of the EU elite are dealing with this development. On the one side, you have the Euro technocrats. You have the Eurozone finance chief with whom the Greek finance minister met today, and they kind of talked about what's going to happen in this coming month before the negotiation of the debt. You have other technocrats, of course, like Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister, and symbolically you have Angela Merkel. And these people seem very committed to preserving the foundations of the Eurozone, which really are the foundations of economic orthodoxy, of balancing budgets, and of reducing inflation. On the other hand, you have Greek capital, which is trying to deal with Syriza's election with less hostility, and to say that they're able to deal with this without drama, as one of them said in an interview to Bloomberg yesterday. And they it's in their interest to have a country with political stability. So they don't want to shake up the game. And they can say, fine, you can have your reversal of the privatization, but you're going to stick to the central tenets of your campaign promise, which was to remain in the Eurozone and the EU and the NATO. And I think these are going to be the big constraints that the Tsipras administration is going to face.
Right. Nantina Vagontinas is my guest. She's a Greek-American student here in the United States in New York, has lived in Greece, of course, and visited there in 2012 and will be returning to Greece in the coming weeks now that Syriza has been elected as the majority party. Well, it has a slim majority, almost majority. It is actually in a coalition with a anti-austerity right-wing party as well. So, Nantina, can you tell us a little bit about the reaction from Germany, given the history? Now, Germany is enjoying a very strong economy, relatively speaking, but doesn't that have something to do with how German debt was actually wiped out in 1948 after World War II by the U.S. and its allies, including Greece? Shouldn't Germany give Greece the same chance now?
Yeah, people have talked about that a lot. And Tsipras, had even talked about, let's have a second New Deal in Europe. We forgave Germany. Let's now have Greek debt forgiven. I think, of course, we need to think about the current complications of the matter, which is why are the Germans so committed to the tenets of economic orthodoxy and the tenets of the Eurozone? People like Krugman in the US, people like Martin Wolf of the Financial Times have said that it's almost hysterical the way that the Germans have been so punitive toward Greece, and that it almost reveals a kind of irrationality. I actually think that economic actors are very rational, and that they're probably doing something because they're representing the interests of those who have put them in power. And I think that they're representing the interests of European capital. European capital doesn't want the foundations of the Eurozone to be tinkered with because this is a monetary union that has elevated Germany as a trade surplus country at the expense of peripheral economies, including the Greek economy. So I think the reaction that we're seeing from Germany is actually very rational if you consider the interests of those whom they represent.
Right.
And so they're never going to talk about, of course, these historical kind of situations where Germany was actually forgiven for its own debt.
So, Nantina, I understand that Syriza wants to remain within the EU, and there are those who don't think that that is necessarily in the best interests of Greeks. What is your position? What is the position of maybe others within the party or who are sort of looking at it critically?
Yeah, so there is an internal debate within Syriza about this. On the one side, you have the pro-Eurozone folks who are represented by the leadership, Tsipras, and also key people in his cabinet, including the finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, who has actually articulated a plan for reforming the monetary union through quantitative easing, which is a way of creating money, a tool used by central banks, and also more long-term measures of increasing investment levels in the Eurozone. So he thinks that's doable, and that's something that's going to be good for all actors in the Eurozone. There are other people in the other camp, the camp that is advocating for Greece to really consider using as a bargaining chip and also as an actual policy of exiting the Eurozone. And the person who really has been advancing this within Syriza is Kostas Lapavitsas, who also is in Syriza's cabinet. He was recently elected on its ticket this past Sunday. And he has created his own plan. And you can find it in a book that was released on the day of the elections by Verso as a way of humanely and kind of reasonably exiting the Eurozone. The thing that he finds to be the biggest constraint on Greece, even if it's able to renegotiate the debt, even if they're able to achieve some levels of quantitative easing, and Mario Draghi, who's the president of the European Central Bank, has indicated some of that partially, in response to Syriza's coming to power, even if they're able to make the Eurozone this place that doesn't require such severe austerity for Greece, you still have the question of trade surplus versus trade deficit countries. And the reason that Germany was able to emerge as a trade surplus country in the past decade was because of wage compression within Germany. And you would require coordinated wage adjustment policies in order to deal with that. And that is something that's politically off the table in Germany. You would actually need a government in Germany that, like now in Greece, would represent the interests of the popular classes in Germany. And of course, you don't see that anytime in the near future.
Finally, Nantina, let's talk about the international political waves, or I should say at least regionally, the political waves that Tsipras is making. Some commentators have said that Russia's Vladimir Putin is the big winner in Greece's elections because Tsipras has thrown a roadblock into Europe's hardline stance on Ukraine and sanctions against Russia over Ukraine. Any sense of what Tsipras's political agenda is regarding foreign policy?
Well, I think there are a lot of international actors that could potentially gain from this situation of uncertainty as we're entering into the negotiations. Tsipras, of course, is committed to remaining in the EU, in the Eurozone, and in NATO. So, coalitions with governments that would counterpose against that power, such as in Latin America, are kind of off the table at this point. But yes, regional actors like Russia might be used more as a chip in the bargaining. And Yanis Varoufakis, again, the finance minister, he posted on his blog the other day that they didn't take this stance because in principle they were opposed to the sanctions, but because the Greek government wasn't even notified that this was going to happen, and that this was really a way of standing on their ground. So you're going to see, because they're so constrained within this position of not leaving the Eurozone, they're going to find other ways of creating bargaining chips. The question is, are those going to be enough to outweigh the biggest bargaining chip, which is the threat of Germany and of the EU to kick Greece out of the Eurozone? And I think that's something we're going to see much sooner than we think. I think what we're going to see, perhaps one route that the EU elites are going to take is to say, sure, we can reduce some of the debt, but that's going to be in exchange for your continued implementation of austerity reforms. Of course, that would be a major capitulation on the part of Syriza. So again, it's a bit in a tough corner. I think we're going to, on Syriza's end, what its most fundamental bargaining chip is the popular mobilizations that brought it into power. So we're going to see if those are going to, have a kind of resurgence again, and if the Sousa government is going to be able to challenge them in a way, in a way that, threatens a kind of slowdown in the economy that would then incentivize certain actors to place pressure on those at the negotiating table.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Nantina, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Nantina Vagontsas is a Greek-American PhD student in sociology at New York University and very active in the labor movement. They're currently a member of the UAW Graduate Student Organizing Committee, and she's lived and worked in Athens. And she is also with the New York City-based Greek Solidarity Group, AKNY. And by the way, you can hear an interview that I did with the current Greek Finance Minister, Yanis Varoufakis, on our website, uprisingwithsonali.com. Just do a search on our website for his first name, Yanis, and you'll find that. That was a year and a half ago. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll come here to the United States and go to Denver. Stay tuned. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. You can now watch Uprising on Free Speech TV, which airs on Dish Network, Channel 9415, DirecTV, Channel 348, and on hundreds of part-time cable affiliates and on Roku. Police in Denver, Colorado are under fire this week for the shooting death of a 16-year-old girl named Jessie Hernandez on Monday morning. Hernandez was apparently driving a car that police say was stolen. There were 3 other girls and 1 boy, all teenagers, in the car with her. The officers allege that Hernandez struck one of them in the leg, forcing them to shoot at her. But news media are reporting this is the 4th time in 7 months that Denver police shot at people, claiming they were using their vehicles as weapons. After Hernandez was shot multiple times by 2 officers, her body was reportedly handcuffed, pushed around, and searched while she lay dying. There was no immediate medical assistance, similar to the case of 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who was killed by police in Cleveland, Ohio. Hernandez, who was openly gay, was loved in her community, and her death was protested this week by her family and friends who are outraged at what they see as yet another instance of police abuse. Joining me now from Denver is Dave Strano with the Denver Community Defense Coalition and Jessie Hernandez's cousin, Robert Guerrero. Welcome to Uprising.
Hi. I guess we just want to clarify, Robert's not actually related to the family at all. He's also with Denver Community Defense.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Well, what do we know about what really happened? Are there videos of the incident or any other documentation? Does the police version differ from that of the witnesses?
I want to preface this by saying that right now to speculate on the exact facts is a little dangerous, especially with potential litigation coming up in the future. Also, we're not necessarily speaking on behalf of the family, so I don't want to say anything that might damage their case. But what we can say is that in the immediate aftermath of the situation, witnesses that were in the car were all arrested, and they were taken by police and dealt with the way that police normally deal with people in a criminal investigation. But those people were all silenced pretty immediately. And then as far as anyone who was trying to film the aftermath or take any video of the police response, they were also intimidated and harassed, and at least one person who took video was arrested as well, and their video was confiscated. So there's been a general attempt by the Denver police to try to control the narrative and control any and all reporting or video or any sort of anecdotal observations of what happened and to stifle anyone from differing with the actual official account of what occurred that day.
So why are there so many incidents? In just 7 months of police saying that they were attacked by people in their cars to justify shootings? Is this some sort of bizarre trend that police are claiming?
You know, we don't know if it's just coincidental or if the moving car has now become the new planted gun, if it's just a convenient excuse for opening fire on mostly black and brown drivers in Denver, starting with Ryan Ronquillo in July 2nd of 2014, would have been the first of the 4 incidents that you're referencing. He was actually in a parked car when the police attempted to apprehend him outside of a funeral. He was sitting in a car at a funeral when the police barged in with 2 unmarked vehicles, slammed into his vehicle, and then shot his car over 12 times. So even in that situation, they claim that he put the car in reverse and hit a cop. But in that moment, as the situation unfolded, when the police first made contact with him, the car wasn't even moving. And that was actually the case in a second situation as well with Sherrod Kindle, where the car wasn't initially moving either until police pulled over Sherrod, intervened with Sherrod, pulled him out of the car, and then his foot moved off of the brake, causing the car to move backwards against the police cruiser. So we have multiple incidents where there may or may not have been a crime that was even initially occurring at the time that the police contacted the suspects, but because a vehicle may or may not have moved during the police altercation, they use that as an excuse to open fire and kill or seriously wound the occupant of the vehicle.
Robert, what has the public response been? Can you tell us about the organizing that has taken place in Denver, not just around the death of Jesse Hernandez, but in general around police violence?
Well, the response from the community has definitely been very loud, whether officials from the Denver Police Department or the city acknowledge those voices or not. The organizing for Ryan Ronquillo has taken form in a series of street marches, but also community events raising funds to help bury Ryan Ronquillo. And in general, those marches have all been what we consider to be rather successful. Super empowering for the community, for the family and friends of everyone involved, and definitely confrontational to an extent with the police, letting them know that these communities won't take this kind of oppression and assassination of our young youth of color.
So let me ask the both of you what the families of these young folks are going through. I understand that your organization, the Denver Community Defense Committee, is working closely with the families of some of those who have been killed by police in the past year. Is there a sense that people need to get really organized, for example, like has been done in Ferguson?
Definitely. I mean, our contention as the Denver Community Defense Committee is that, again, we don't necessarily speak for the families. We want to be clear on that. The families speak for themselves. But from our work, it's very important to us that we honor the wishes of the families as we pursue justice. And right now, the family members that we're working directly with on various cases are very confrontational and are very angry. There's a lot of fury that's coming out of these cases, especially seeing youth just murdered outside of funerals or in the alley behind a friend's grandmother's house, So there's a lot of anger. There's a lot of raw emotion. And I think, unfortunately, there happens to be a lot of people that are trying to either capitalize off of that or use it for their own political agendas or try to stifle the very real anger that these families are facing. So what we've been trying to do as Denver Community Defense is to meet with the families, understand where they want to be with their organizing, and push forward their agendas in whatever way that looks like. And sometimes it's not pretty. Sometimes it doesn't fit well into a small activist box of what we consider acceptable protest or dissent. But we're here to help support those families as they struggle for justice.
And Robert, is there any evidence to suggest that people of color are being disproportionately targeted by police? I mean, certainly we know that's true nationwide, particularly African-American men. But in Denver, which has its own unique demographics, do you see a disproportionate police violence against young people of color?
Absolutely. A lot of the poor youth of color in this city oftentimes turn to activities for survival that are considered criminal. And it's because of those systemic conditions that youth of color face in this city, that they're targeted by the police and like we see, followed and eventually killed by the police.
I mean, that's not to necessarily suggest, I think, that all of the kids who have been and young folks that have been targeted and killed were committing crimes, right?
Certainly not, no. But
Yeah. Well, finally, let me ask the two of you what you hope for in terms of national solidarity. I mentioned Ferguson earlier, which really sparked a national conversation on the issue of police brutality. Are you hoping for activists from around the country, people making connections with your organization and with what's happening on the local level in Denver?
absolutely, at this point, nationwide, there's definitely been an outpouring of support. We've already seen the case be picked up nationally and disseminated amongst folks all over the country. So this case is definitely resonating powerfully and loudly from the very start.
But I think one thing that's important for us is we want to support the Hernandez family and definitely look at Jesse's case and look at it as an atrocious act that needs to be followed up on across the nation. But we don't want to lose sight of the greater pattern and picture that's developed in Denver, especially of targeting of Mexican community members and black community members in this city. And so as long as we're talking about the Hernandez case, we have to connect it to a broader attack on black and brown communities in this city and across the country as well. So that's what we're also asking nationally is let's remember Jesse Hernandez, let's remember Ryan Ronquillo, let's remember all the victims here locally and nationally, but also understand that there are real conditions that are making these police murders and this police violence not only possible but necessary for the police to hold on to social control within this country right now.
Well, I want to thank the two of you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Best of luck to you. David Strano and Robert Guerrero are both with the Denver Community Defense Committee, and we've been talking about not just the case of Jesse Hernandez, but Ryan Ronquillo and several others in Denver in particular, where there has been an uptick in police violence that seemingly is targeting young folks of color. Well, after 3 years in prison, the state of Florida has released Marissa Alexander after she accepted a plea deal for time served. The deal includes 2 years of house arrest. Inspiring nationwide protests and outrage, Alexander is an African-American woman who was criminally prosecuted and imprisoned for using a gun to fire a warning shot to deter her abusive husband. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison, even though she was defending herself and no one was killed or even injured in the altercation. Alexander's attorneys were unsuccessful in using Florida's controversial stand your ground laws to legally justify firing a gun in self-defense, even though her case seemed like a textbook one. Although she is free to go home technically, she remains under constant electronic surveillance. Her movements are severely restricted. Advocates say that the fact that she is a woman, African American, and a victim of domestic violence all contributed to a miscarriage of justice. My guest is Elisa Bieria. She is a member of the Free Marissa Now mobilization campaign. Hi, Elisa.
Hi, how you doing?
Doing well. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first, to explain what led to Alexander's sentence being shortened. She was initially sentenced to 20 years. Outpouring of support from around the country from groups like yours. Has public pressure helped her 20-year sentence to be shortened?
Well, let's back up. She was originally sentenced to 20 years mandatory minimum in 2012, but she successfully appealed that sentence in the fall of 2013. We organized to urge the state of Florida to drop the case at that point, which they had the power to do. But instead of dropping the case, State Prosecutor Angela Corey actually threatened. She said she was going to re-prosecute Marissa Alexander, but this time she threatened a tripled sentence of 60 years in prison. So from the date of the appeal all the way through the time that she accepted the plea in November 2014, she was looking at the possibility of spending the rest of her life in prison. So when she accepted the plea included time served, which was almost 3 years in prison, 65 additional days in Duval County Jail, which would complete a full 3-year sentence behind bars, and then 2 additional years of house detention, which is pretty strict. She's not allowed to leave her home, with the exception of going to work, to church, to take her children to school, and for doctors and court appointments. so that she has to do that for 2 additional years. So the reason that she took the plea, the reason it came down, the sentence didn't come down. She took the plea because she was terrified that she would have to spend the rest of her life behind bars and away from her children and the rest of her family.
Now, she also has to, as part of this house arrest, wear an ankle bracelet, an electronic ankle bracelet that she has to pay for, something like $100 a month?
That's right. No, it's $105 a week.
A week?
Yes, yes, yes.
Wow.
So it's about $10,000 at almost 11 actually, $11,000. So it's really it's part of this ongoing this practice of the prison basically extending itself outside of actual literal prison walls into our homes and into our communities. Professor Beth Ritchie calls this the prison nation. It's basically a prison culture of surveillance and confinement and humiliation, particularly for Black women, that we now experience in our schools, on the streets, in our workplaces, and of course in our homes. And so, yes, this ankle surveillance monitor that Marissa is forced to wear and to pay for is part of that growing prison nation.
Now, Elisa, why do you think Marissa Alexander's case in particular attracted so much attention nationwide? I mean, there's thousands of women of color and women in general who are imprisoned, many of them unfairly. But why did her case in particular spark outrage?
You know, it's a real problem that more cases do not spark outrage. I think that Marissa's case sort of rose to some level of media attention because of the ways in which it was connected, or people were connecting it to the prosecution of George Zimmerman after he murdered Trayvon Martin. Right. And so George Zimmerman, I don't think that he did a stand your ground defense hearing, a hearing for immunity from prosecution. But I know that his attorney argued from the perspective of that law in the trial. And after Zimmerman was acquitted, the jurors on that trial said they referred to the stand your ground law for the reasons they felt compelled to acquit him. And so Marissa's case became juxtaposed to Zimmerman's case. And, there was this, of course, this horrible lack of consistency where you have Zimmerman who killed a child and was acquitted, and Marissa who acted in self-defense and then was sentenced originally to 20 years.
And she killed or injured nobody.
She fired a single warning shot upwards into the wall. And it caused 0 injuries.
Which is possibly the best way one can use a gun, best scenario one can see using a gun in self-defense, a sort of classic case that you often hear gun rights activists say that that's why they have guns or keep guns. But of course, I didn't see gun rights activists necessarily jump to her defense. Do you know if the gun lobby was upholding Marissa Alexander as a hero?
Well, not a hero. So I do think that the National Rifle Association did some advocacy or had some kind of affirmation of Marissa's right to self-defense behind the scenes. But they did not come out with a strong media support of her and her case. So I would not think that she's a hero for them. And I think the reason is because it's one thing to say that we all have the right to defend ourselves using firearms if necessary if we're white, and it's a whole other thing to say that if we're Black. And so the real question is which one of us has the right to live, right? And so the state's prosecution of Marissa Alexander is a real threat to Black women's right to exist, and also, of course, all women's right to self-defense. Right. And so I think that there's a really important racialized politics when it comes to self-defense. It's really inconsistent.
Finally, Elisa, we mentioned the $10,000 plus a year that Marissa Alexander is going to have to shell out to pay for state surveillance of her. I'm sure she and her family are burdened by all sorts of additional legal costs as well. Is there an effort to financially support her now that she's at least out of prison and with her children, and symbolically at least help her through financing to move on with her life?
Well, we've raised about $100,000 to date. And by we, I mean people all over the world. Certainly here in the United States, there have been really amazing pushes for donations all across the country. I do want to give a specific shout out to the Chicago Alliance to Free Marissa Alexander, which did a recent fundraising push to raise $11,000 to make sure that she wouldn't have to cover the cost of that ankle monitor herself. But yeah, trying to defend yourself from the attack, a prosecutorial attack from the state, is enormously expensive. If she had gone to trial, her pro bono legal team was estimating that the legal costs would be about $250,000.
Wow.
So that is what she was looking at. But even still, now that she's accepted the plea, she has to figure out how to become employed, especially as a felon, and especially while under house detention, which is extremely complicated. And she has, 3 or 4 years of lost wages that she has to deal with. So it's enormously expensive, and we really need to integrate a politics of economic justice when we're talking about the ways in which the prison crisis is impacting our communities.
Has she been heartened by the solidarity she has received? Has she spoken out about the support?
Marissa has consistently been articulate about thanking her hundreds and thousands of supporters around the world. I think that she's just been very moved by this outpouring of love and support and rage, solidarity, right? And I think that
And that's the sort of thing that can keep somebody from going insane when they're in that situation, to know that there's people paying attention, listening, and who care about her well-being.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And so she was able to receive letters while she was behind bars. And I think that just a lot of people have written her and tried to connect with her, including other survivors of domestic violence, really wanting to let her know that she's not alone, that we see what's going on with her, and we're standing with her.
Well, I want to thank you very much for joining us, Alisa. Is there a website that you'd like to give out?
Yes, please, everyone go to freemarissanow.org. You'll find the donation link on that page, and as well as a wealth of resources.
And that's freemarissanow.org. Marissa is with 2 S's. And thank you so much, Alisa.
Thank you so much.
Alisa Bieria is a member of the Free Marissa Now mobilization campaign. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll take a look at President Obama's 2016 budget proposal. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. President Obama yesterday unveiled a budget proposal to Congress calling for an end to spending caps on both domestic and military expenses. Those cuts were the results of months of political battles in 2013 known as sequestration. President Obama has included funding for a host of programs in his 2016 fiscal budget that Republicans consider anathema. His proposal sets up the next major political battle between the president and Republicans, who now control both houses of Congress. Mr. Obama laid out the policies reflected in this budget in his recent State of the Union address, and in an op-ed that he wrote yesterday in the Huffington Post, the president said, quote, "My budget will fully reverse the sequestration cuts for domestic priorities in 2016. It will match those investments with equal dollar increases for defense funding. If Congress rejects my plan and refuses to undo these arbitrary cuts, it will threaten our economy and our military. Investments in key areas will fall to their lowest level in 10 years, adjusted for inflation, putting American research, education, infrastructure, and national security at risk. But if Congress joins me, we can make sure that ending sequestration is fully paid for by cutting inefficient spending and closing loopholes, tax loopholes, that is. Joining me now is Lindsay Koshgarian. She is the research director with National Priorities Project. Hi, Lindsay.
Hi, Sonali.
Well, let's get into the numbers. According to Reuters, the budget proposal is a roughly 7% spending increase over these sequester limits. That includes $530 billion in non-defense discretionary spending. That's $37 billion above the caps. $561 billion, which is more, in defense outlays, which is $38 billion above the caps. That's a lot of defense spending. Is this budget disproportionately favorable to the military?
That is a lot of defense spending, and it's historically a very high level of defense spending as well. Of that $561 billion in defense spending, $534 billion of it is for the base Pentagon budget, and that's not even including an additional $50 billion for war spending. And that $534 billion, it would be historically the highest level for the base Pentagon funding in our history. So, there really is a real question about why we would need such a high level of spending right now. And one answer, of course, that people give is the current fight and the threat from the Islamic State, or ISIS, as people call it. But what's interesting about this budget is that it only lays aside $5.3 billion in war funding specifically targeted for ISIS. So the vast majority of that funding is for regular Pentagon operations, the ongoing fight in Afghanistan, which itself is drawing to a close. So there really is a question about why this level of funding needs to be so historically high at this point in time.
And let's go back a little bit. And can you remind our audience how these so-called sequestration cuts came about in the first place? In a nutshell, I mean, this took place in 2013, and the word sequester and sequestration, these were being bandied about in the media, but it's a bit of an obscure term.
Yes. So, I mean, what's important to note is that the official across-the-board cuts under sequestration have not actually taken effect. Back a couple of years ago, there was the Murray-Ryan deal, which was the bipartisan budget act that set slightly higher levels for spending for both defense and non-defense spending that avoided the full impact of sequestration cuts. But that deal only lasted 2 years. So coming up on fiscal year 2016, that threat of sequestration of the blind across-the-board cuts to spending comes back into play if Congress can't work out a deal to avoid that.
So if we are to have sensible national priorities, certainly discretionary spending on non-military is a good thing. It helps people. But then tying that to military spending in the interest of national security, as though if we throw out the words national security, we can justify anything, this doesn't seem to fit in line with President Obama's State of the Union address that he had recently, and this op-ed that he wrote in the Huffington Post, A Blueprint for Middle-Class Economics. He seems to be trying to sneak in this historically high military budget by tying it to non-military spending.
Yes, the politics of this are bizarre. As you noted at the outset, the non-defense segment of the president's budget is $37 billion above the budget caps, while the defense segment is $38 billion above the budget caps on the defense side. That's not an accident. There is a very real, and has been from the start of this sequestration debate, there has been this segmentation of defense and non-defense where the cuts were supposed to be equal on both sides. But that does suggest somehow that defense ought to be a certain portion of our budget, and that any increase in non-defense spending for things like the middle class initiatives that President Obama has proposed has to always be met by an increase on the defense side. Now, you might think that the spending on defense ought to be driven by our actual national security needs, and that spending on non-defense and domestic programs ought to be driven by those needs, but the politics of this are just incredibly wound up in each other.
Now, the president plans to pay for these increases, as he said, by, quote, trimming inefficient spending programs and eliminating tax loopholes. He didn't say anything about increasing taxes on the wealthy. And it's always sort of fearful to hear inefficient spending programs needing to be trimmed, because you sort of wonder, which programs are they talking about? Food stamps or Social Security or Medicare, and what, whose definition of inefficient, right, are we meeting? So what do you think of that?
Well, there's a long history of everyone on all sides saying that we need to trim inefficient spending, and of course the devil's in the details, as you suggested. And when it comes time to actually identify which programs those are and start to cut the dollars, that's where things start to fall apart, and that's where we frequently don't see cuts, or we see cuts to things like you say, like food stamps that many people consider to be absolutely essential. So
let's actually also talk about the fact that Republicans, Lindsay, have been bringing up the issue of income inequality, because perhaps they realize that the Democrats are hitting upon a very important point that strikes a chord in the American public.
Right.
A lot of the presidential candidates are bringing up the issue of income inequality. They're even using the words income inequality when, a few years ago, President Obama bringing it up meant he was a socialist. But I'm not hearing many ideas from Republicans about how they should be reducing income inequality. I'm guessing that it's going to be the standard Republican solution, which is dealing with income inequality by trickle-down economics rather than raising taxes on the rich. We've had that for decades, and that hasn't worked.
Yes, it's true. One thing, President Obama put forward quite a few proposals around education, around job training, around infrastructure investment, and most of the word from Republicans has been that those proposals are DOA, dead on arrival, in Congress. So the president's proposals apparently are a non-starter for Congress, but it's true, there is a bit of a void on the other side. We just heard that Mitt Romney will not be running for president,
Yes.
but he gave a speech recently where he talked up how welfare reform had been such a resounding success and put so many people back to work, but it hasn't addressed the underlying issues of income inequality. Those are still getting worse. So it's true, does seem to be some sort of a lack of proposals on the other side, while we are hearing a resounding no to President Obama's proposals. And Obama, as you alluded to a few minutes ago, also did call for some tax plans. And while the emphasis hasn't been necessarily on rhetoric around raising taxes for the wealthy, one of the major tax proposals that in President's proposal is to raise capital gains tax, both the rate and to close an existing loophole that lets folks hand down their capital gains investments and income to their children without seeing that taxed.
Right.
So it would raise taxes on both of those things. And that the vast majority of those tax hits extremely well-off people. It doesn't affect those people who are earning their income from work. It only affects those people who are earning significant chunks of income from investments.
Right, and of course, certainly that is a progressive tax proposal. Now, let's talk about, even if we accept that linking non-defense spending to defense spending may be the only way to politically get it through, President Obama is facing Republican majorities in both houses of Congress now. Given the political battles we've seen in the past, what are the odds that any of his proposals could make it through this intractable party chokehold on Congress?
Well, it's not setting up well. As I mentioned, Republicans have already taken to saying that the president's proposals are DOA in Congress. So it's not exactly opening the debate on a good note. I think that many of the president's proposals are extremely unappealing to Republicans. What's interesting about the Republican Party right now, of course, is that we have this Tea Party faction that seems like it's controlling the debate a bit less than it was when sequestration originally was put in place. We're hearing less sort of deficit talk and less talk of needing to control spending. But there is still that element within the Republican Party, and many of those folks, not only do they want to see cuts on the non-defense side, but they also do want to see cuts on the defense side. So the Republican Party itself sort of doesn't come from one position and in one flavor. And even if President Obama and the Democrats were willing to give more defense spending to get more non-defense spending, it's not clear that that's something that the Republicans on the whole would take them up on.
Well, finally, what about the fact that that Americans are hurting pretty strongly right now, and we are seeing some organizing happening and some grassroots push to raise the minimum wage? Is there even one point that the parties, the president, could agree on because it's getting a lot of public pressure? And that is, for example, raising the minimum wage, even if that's not going to be part of the defense, part of the rather the budget proposal discussion in terms of national financial priority. Do you foresee, one thing that could benefit the middle class, such as raising the minimum wage, actually happening in the next year or two?
The minimum wage, I think, is doubtful at a federal level. That's something where the Republican establishment is still very reluctant to embrace it. But what we have seen, of course, is that happening on a state level.
Yeah.
And interestingly, we've seen some Republican governors starting to call for increasing tax revenue at the state level as well. So there are rumblings where even some Republicans are acknowledging that government does need revenue and there is a role for government. Whether that translates into Congress, I think is very questionable. We're already hearing a lot about the 2016 presidential races, and that's coming into play. I think there is not a great deal of optimism for this Congress getting a lot more done than previous Congresses have.
Right. The Republican field of candidates is getting increasingly crowded, notwithstanding Romney's announcement today that he won't run. But the Democratic field of candidates is still fairly narrow, and it just seems as though Hillary Clinton may be the only one who throws her hat into the ring. Still, as we know, it's not just about who the president is, but what the makeup of Congress is. And we'll have to see what happens there in terms of progress for the middle class. Give out a website for your organization, Lindsay?
Yes, www.nationalpriorities.org.
And we'll post that to uprisingwithsonali.com later today. I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Lindsay Kojgarian is a research director with the group National Priorities Project. Again, nationalpriorities.org is their website. By the way, I'll be on vacation all week next week, and we will be re-airing some of our best programs from the past few weeks and months, so definitely tune in for that. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Michael Casey is our research intern. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Christian Beck is our production assistant. Teddy Robinson and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Camilo Ramirez is our sound editor. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. Have a wonderful weekend.